Cora Fenn was 20 years old the day they laughed at her in a barn full of men. She stood in the sawdust of the Dawson Valley estate auction in her dead father's coat, a coat cut for a bigger man, the sleeves rolled twice at her wrists. And a single ear of seed corn rolled off the table and came to a stop against her boot. Nobody bent to pick it up. The auctioneer's boy scooped the men's lots away from her hands like she was a draft in the room, and when the good seed came up, the land baron who was buying the whole valley for pennies turned to the 40 men on the rail and said, loud, so every one of them could hear it, "Let the girl have it. She'll boil it by August." The barn laughed. She raised her hand anyway. $86. Every cent she owned in this world. And she carried those sacks out on her own shoulder, past all of them, and not one soul knew she wasn't buying corn to eat. She was buying the only thing her father ever swore was worth more than land. If anyone ever told you that you'd be nothing without them, this story is for you. Before we go on, do this one small thing for me. Subscribe so the Valley's story stays with you to the end. And leave a comment telling me the town you're farming in, or working in, or just watching from tonight. I want to see how far this valley's story travels. Now, let me take you back to the winter it all started. They buried Silas Fenn on a Tuesday, in ground so hard the men had to burn a fire over the grave the night before just to break it. He'd gone in 3 days. A winter fever that started as a cough over his breakfast and finished him before the doctor could get out the lane. Cora stood at the edge of that hole in the same coat she'd wear to the auction come spring. And she did not cry where the neighbors could see. The neighbors watched her the way you watch a barn that's leaning, wondering when it'll fall, and glad it isn't yours. They had a name for her father in the valley. The corn tinkerer. They said it soft, the way you say a thing about a man you've decided to pity. Silas Fenn owned 80 acres of the best bottomland in the Dawson Valley. Black dirt you could smell from the road, and he'd let a good third of it go to weeds while he crossed corn plants by hand with a paper sack and a pair of tweezers. He kept notebooks. Oilcloth notebooks, dozens of them, filled edge to edge with a small tight hand, rows and numbers and little drawings of ears cut in half. The men at the feed store used to ask him how his corn was coming, and they'd grin at each other before he even answered. Silas never seemed to notice. Or he noticed and didn't care. Cora could never tell which, and now she'd never ask him. She inherited what he left. 80 acres, a barn with a good roof and a bad door, a team of 2 horses named Belle and Major, her mother's kitchen, 10 years empty, and a mortgage, $640 held by the Cedar Valley Farmers Bank, due at harvest. Due in the fall, in cash, or the land went back to the men who'd lent against it. She knew the figure the way you know a splinter. $640. It sat in her chest all winter. Let me tell you about her hands. Because her hands are the whole story. They were not soft hands. She had dirt worn so deep under the nails that no brush got it all the way out, and a callus on her right palm hard as a booth heel from the pitchfork and the churn and the pump handle. She could set a fence post alone. She could pull a calf. She could read weather off the west sky better than most men twice her age, and she could sit at her father's table on a Sunday and read his notebooks by lamp oil, and she understood more of them than anyone alive. That was the thing nobody in the valley knew. She understood them. She'd grown up at his elbow in those weedy rows, holding the sacks, writing the numbers he called out. And she had learned the whole strange grammar of it without ever once being told it mattered. She had one dress, kept in the wardrobe in paper, for town and for church and for funerals. Everything else was her father's cut-down shirts and a pair of overalls gone soft as flannel. She was alone out there on the 80 acres in a way that's hard to make you feel. No mother, no brother, no hired man she could pay. A dog named Rook who slept across the door. And the long math of $640 against a farm she was working single-handed. She'd lie awake and do the numbers in the dark. So much corn at so much a bushel, if the price held, if the weather held, if nothing broke. It never came out to enough. She knew it never came out to enough. But she got up every morning before light anyway, and she did the work. Because the work was the only prayer she had left. Now in the early spring, before a seed was in the ground, the valley emptied a farm the way the valley did in those years. Old Emil Bergstrom lost his place to the bank. 71 years old, a seedsman his whole life, and the depression took his ground the same as it took everybody's. And they set his life out on planks in his own yard to be sold off to the highest hand. Cora hitched Bell and Major and drove the wagon over, because that was where the seed would be. Bergstrom Gold. The most famous seed corn in 3 counties. Emil had bred it up over 40 years, and every honest farmer who could afford it planted it. And now it was going on the block with his churns and his harness and his wife's good chairs. The whole valley came to a sale like that. Not to grieve. To pick the bones. They stood around in the cold mud in their coats, and they bid on a dead man's living, except Emil wasn't dead. He was standing off by the corn crib in a suit that no longer fit him, watching strangers price his life. And that is a worse thing than a funeral, and everyone there knew it and nobody looked at him. Cora worked her way up toward the tables where the seed sat in cloth sacks, and here is the small thing, the first thing, the thing no one witnessed but her. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, waiting, and a single ear of seed corn worked loose from an open sack on the table. It rolled. It rolled right off the plank and dropped, and came to rest against the toe of her boot. Gold kernels, deep and even, an ear so perfect it looked drawn. And she waited for someone to notice, for the boy to come snatch it back the way he snatched everything back. Nobody did. Nobody even saw it fall. So she bent, slow, and she picked it up and she turned it in her fingers. And she felt something go tight and quiet in her. Because she knew this ear. Not this one ear. But this blood. Her father had spent 9 years crossing his own lines into Bergstrom stock. 9 years with the sack and the tweezers, borrowing Emil's foundation and breeding his own secret into it, and the last of that work, the last living seed of 9 years of a laughed-at man's life, was sitting right here on these planks about to be sold off to men who'd plant it and grind it and never know what they had. She said it under her breath to no one. Just to herself, just the plain truth of it, the way you'd note the weather. The last of Papa's blood is in these sacks. And she slid that one loose ear into the deep pocket of the big coat. And she said nothing. And she stayed. I want you to hold on to that ear. You'll see it again. Now the auctioneer moved off the household goods and started in on the seed and the field lots, and this is where the second thing happened. The thing with one witness. There was a table at these sales run by the growers' co-op. A man taking names, because the co-op was the only legal way a body could sell registered seed in that county. If your name wasn't on the co-op book, your seed was just corn, worth feed price, nothing more. Cora had thought this through all winter. She meant to sell seed. She had her father's lines, and she meant to build them into something and sell it registered, and the first step, the plain first step, was to get her name in that book. So she went to the counter where Del Pruitt sat. You'll want to remember Del Pruitt. 40 years old, big through the middle, a buyer for the land baron and the loudest man at any sale. He had a way of talking that filled a room whether the room wanted filling or not. Cora stood at his counter in her father's coat, and she asked, plain and even, to register as a seed grower. And Pruitt looked her up and down, slow. And he smiled the smile of a man about to say a thing he finds clever. Seed selling's for houses, darlin', he said. Not for house girls. And there was a neighbor standing right there. Amos Kettleman. A man who'd bought eggs off her mother for 15 years. And Amos heard every word of it. And Amos looked at his own boots and said nothing. That's the thing that made it a debt. Not the words. Pruitt was a fool, and his words were a fool's words. But Amos looking away. A man she'd known her whole life, deciding in that half a second that it was easier to study his boots than to say, now Dell, that's Silas Fenn's girl, let her sign the book. He didn't. He looked away. And Cora took her name back off her own tongue, and she stepped away from that counter, and she felt the second stone go into the sack she was carrying. The invisible one. The one that gets heavier all your life until you find a way to set it down. He opened the account for her in the end. Pruitt did, laughing, because the rules said he had to, and a witness or not, he wasn't going to make a scene of breaking the rules. He wrote her name in the book with a flourish like it was a joke he was telling. Cora Fenn. Grower, and every man near the counter grinned. But the name was in the book. She'd remember that later. The name was in the book. And then the big lots came up. The seed lots. The Bergstrom gold. The barn was full now, the real barn. They'd moved inside out of the wind. 40-some men on the rails and along the walls, the air thick with cold breath and pipe smoke and the smell of old hay. The auctioneer held up the first sack of the Bergstrom seed and started his patter. And the bids came in, and here is where the land baron entered it. Vernon Thorne, 56 years old, a long gray man in a good gray coat, and he did not farm. He owned. He'd spent 3 years buying up every foreclosed acre in 3 counties for pennies on the dollar, and folks stood a little straighter when he came in a room and hated him a little more when he left it, and both of those things suited him fine. Thorne didn't want the seed to grow. Understand that. He wanted it dead. He was buying the whole valley cheap, farm by broke farm, and the last thing he needed was some rival strain of good corn surviving in it, giving a beaten farmer a reason to hold on one more year. He'd have been happiest if the Bergstrom gold went into a grinder and came out feed. So he bid on it. Idly, the way a rich man bids, a flick of 2 fingers, running the price up not because he wanted it, but because he wanted to be the one who ended it. 60, 70, 80, the real farmers dropped out one by one, because $80 was a farm's whole seed budget and more, and it came down to Thorne bidding against himself, and at 85 he stopped. He let it hang there, $85, going once. And then he did the thing that made this a story worth telling you. He turned. He turned his back on the auctioneer, and he faced the 40 men on the rail, and he found Cora Fenn where she stood at the edge in her dead father's coat with her father's blood in her pocket. And he smiled at her the way you smile at a child who's wandered somewhere she shouldn't be. And he said it for all of them. Let the girl have it. A pause, so they'd lean in. She'll boil it by August. And the barn laughed. I need you to hear that laugh, because everything after this is Cora answering it. It wasn't cruel, exactly, that's what made it worse. It was easy. 40 men laughing the easy laugh of men who've all agreed on who the fool is and are glad, down deep, that it isn't them. The girl in the man's coat. The tinkerer's daughter, going to buy seed corn to eat, going to boil good registered Bergstrom gold in a pot like feed. It was the funniest thing they'd seen at a sad sale on a cold day, and they took it. They laughed. They leaned on each other and laughed, and Amos Kettleman laughed too, the man who'd looked away at the counter. He laughed now, because it was safe to. Cora's face did not change. That's the part they'd all misremember later. Every one of them. They'd all swear her face went red or her eyes went wet. And it didn't. She had buried her father in frozen ground 8 weeks before and hadn't cried where they could see. She wasn't going to give them this either. She stood in the noise and she did the math one more time. The only math that mattered. The $86 folded flat in the pocket against her father's ear of corn. Everything. It was everything. It was the whole cash cushion between her and the $640 note, gone in a breath if she raised her hand. She'd have nothing but 80 acres and a bad season's odds. And she raised her hand. 86, she said, not loud. She didn't need loud. The barn had gone quiet enough to hear a match strike because a girl bidding against Vernon Thorne was a better show than the joke. The auctioneer looked at Thorne. Thorne looked at the girl. And you could see him decide it wasn't worth the $87 to keep the seed from her. Because in his arithmetic she was already finished, she was a foreclosure he hadn't gotten to yet. And the corn would die with her farm in the fall, and he'd buy the ground with the dead seeds still in the crib. He gave a little wave. Take it. Going once, going twice. Sold to the girl. For $86, every cent she had in the world. Now watch her, because this is the picture, this is the thing the whole video is built around. There was no one to help her load it. There is never anyone to help you load it, that's a thing you learn. The men went back to their talk and their pipes. And Cora Fenn walked up to that table, and she took up the sacks of Bergstrom seed corn, the last living blood of her father's 9 years, and she swung the first sack up onto her shoulder herself. And the second. And she carried them out of that barn on her own back, past the rail, past the 40 men, past Vernon Thorne, out into the cold spring light where the wagons stood with Bell and Major stamping in the traces. Sack after sack. Alone, and behind her a few of them were still chuckling, and one of them called out something she didn't turn for. And she loaded her wagon, and she climbed up, and she clucked to the horses, and she drove out of that yard with her spine straight as a fence line, and her jaw set. And not one of those men, not a single one of them, had the first idea what she was carrying away from them. She wasn't buying corn to eat. She was buying the only thing her father ever said was worth more than land. And she knew exactly what she meant to do with it. She'd known since the ear rolled off the table and touched her boot. She drove 3 miles into town with the sacks, but not home. Understand that. She didn't take the seed home first. She drove to the feed store, and she climbed the outside stair to the rented room over it. The room where they'd put Emil Bergstrom after the bank took his farm. Because a man doesn't just lose his ground, he loses his roof, and at 71 Emil was living in one hired room with his whole life reduced to what would fit up a set of stairs. She knocked, and when he opened the door and saw her standing there with a sack of his own seed corn on her shoulder, the old man's face did a thing that hurt to look at. "I've come to bring you what's yours," she said. He wouldn't take it. Of course he wouldn't take it. He stood in the doorway of that mean little room, and he looked at the sacks, and he shook his head, slow, and he said, "It's not mine, girl. The bank sold it. You bought it fair. There's nothing of mine left to give back." And there was so much shame in the old man's voice that Cora nearly turned and went. Because she knew that shame. She'd watched her father carry a version of it his whole life. The shame of a man the valley had decided was a fool. Emil Bergstrom, 40 years the best seedsman in 3 counties, foreclosed and grinning at strangers over his own churns. And now a girl on his doorstep trying to hand him back the one thing he'd built that lasted. But she didn't turn and go. She said the thing she'd come to say. "It's not just yours," she said. "It's my father's too. Silas Fenn. He crossed his lines into your gold for 9 years. It's in these sacks, Mr. Bergstrom, his and yours, both, and I don't think there's another 2 sacks of it left on this earth. And I don't know enough to finish what he started. But I think you do." The old man went very still. He looked at her a long moment in the cold coming up the stairwell. And then he stepped back from the door, and he said, "You'd best bring those in before you drop them. And you'd best have your father's books." She had them. Of course she had them. She'd brought the oilcloth notebooks in a flour sack under the seat, because some part of her had known, driving in, that it would come to this or come to nothing. And they cleared the little table in that rented room, and they lit the lamp though it was daylight, because the window was small, and Emil Bergstrom opened Silas Fenn's notebooks and began to read. And Cora watched an old man's face change. She watched the pity go out of it. She watched the grin, the beaten grin he'd worn at the sale, fall clean off, and something else come up underneath it that she hadn't seen on a grown man in a long time. Wonder, plain wonder. "He never told anybody," Emil said. Half to himself. He was tracing a line of numbers with a finger gone thick at the knuckle. All those years they called him a tinkerer. And he was doing this, right here. He was 3 seasons off. He looked up at her. Do you understand what your father was doing, girl? I held the sacks, Cora said. I wrote the numbers he called. I understand the how of it. I don't understand the why. So he told her the why. And I'm going to tell it to you the plain way he told it to her. Because it's the engine of everything that comes. And because it's a true and beautiful thing that most people never learn. You'd think, Emil said, that the way to get the best corn is to save seed off your best plants. Biggest ear, best stand, save it, plant it, and get better and better every year. And that's what every farmer in this valley does, and it's wrong. It doesn't work like that. Corn wants to cross. Leave it be and it mixes every which way, and you get a field that's part good and part junk and no two ears alike. What Silas was doing, what Emil himself had started and never finished, was the opposite of what looked sensible. You take your best line and you breed it back into itself. Close, on purpose. And the corn hates it. It goes to pieces. The ears come up runty and thin and gap-toothed and small, worse every year, until you've got a row of miserable little nubbins that any farmer walking by would laugh at and call a ruined crop. That's the inbred line. That's the ugly, patient, secret middle of it. You make the corn worse, deliberately, for years, until it's pure. Two separate lines, each one bred down to runty purity, each one looking like failure. And then you cross the two ruined lines against each other. And the thing that comes up out of that cross is not runty. It comes up taller and stronger and more even than either parent, than any corn in the valley, every stalk the same height, every ear full to the tip. Standing up in a wind that lays flat corn down flat. They call it hybrid vigor. Cross two weaknesses just right and you get a strength that neither one had. Silas Fenn had two lines almost bred down to pure. Two ruined-looking little lines of runty corn that held, hidden inside them, the makings of the best hybrid the Dawson Valley would ever see. 3 seasons off. That's all. 3 seasons of finishing. And Cora Fenn was the only person alive who held both the lines and the notebooks that explained them. Not Thorne with all his acres. Not Pruitt with all his noise. A 20-year-old girl in a dead man's coat, with dirt under her nails, standing in a rented room over a feed store. She held the whole thing in 2 flour sacks and a stack of oilcloth books. And she was the only one who did. I can't pay you, she told the old man. I've got 80 acres and a $640 note and no cash till harvest, and probably not then. I can't pay you $1. Did I ask you for $1? Said Emil Bergstrom. And for the first time since the bank took his farm, the old seedsman smiled a real smile. Come Saturday, bring the horses, I'll teach you to detassel. We've got a season to steal and no time to be poor about it. That was the turn. That was where it started to build. And I want to be honest with you about what building it cost her. Because the men who laughed in the barn never had to pay a nickel of it, and she paid all of it. The first cost was ground. To breed the lines the way her father's books laid out, she needed nursery rows, and nursery rows don't make a cash crop. They make runty inbred corn you can't sell and can barely eat, planted in careful blocks with paths between so the wind can't carry the wrong pollen where it shouldn't go. Emil walked her fields with her that first Saturday and paced it off, and when he was done he'd marked out a full third of her plantable ground for breeding. A third. On a farm already too small to make the note. She stood at the edge of that measured-off block and did the math in her head one more time. The terrible math, a third of her cash crop gone to grow corn she couldn't sell, against $640 due in the fall. It didn't come out. It came out worse than it had ever come out. And she drove the first stake anyway. The second cost was her back and her hands and every hour of daylight from April to September. She learned to detassel. That means you walk the rows in the July heat when the corn's over your head, and you pull the tassel, the pollen top, off every single plant in the female rows before it can shed, so that only the pollen you choose gets to the silks. You do it by hand. 10,000 plants, one at a time, reaching up over your head into the leaves that cut your forearms like paper till they bleed and scab and bleed again. And you bag ears. You take a little paper sack and you tie it over an ear before the silk shows, so no stray pollen touches it. And when you're ready, you brush on the pollen you want with your own hand and tie the sack back. And you write it in the book, this line onto that line, ear by ear, sack by sack, down rows that go on forever in the standing heat. It is the most patient, back-breaking, invisible work in all of farming. Nobody drives by and admires it. There's nothing to admire. It just looks like a girl walking slow through corn. And the third cost, the one I didn't expect, and neither did she, was that she wasn't quite as alone as I told you. Because that first morning in the breeding rows, before the sun was full up, Cora looked down her father's marked-off block, and there was a young man already in it. Working, Harlan Voss, the neighbor boy, 24, from the quarter section that ran along her east line. She hadn't asked him. She hadn't said a word to him since the funeral, and even then only 2. And here he was at dawn in her nursery rows with his own gloves on, detasseling, doing the work the right way. The way that meant somebody had told him or shown him, or that he'd stood at a fence and watched and figured it out. She stood there a minute, not knowing what to say. And Harlan Voss looked up from the row, and he didn't smile exactly, he just nodded, once, the way you nod at a thing that's already decided, and he went back to pulling tassels. And that was the whole conversation. That was more or less the whole conversation for the entire summer. He came at dawn, he worked the rows beside her, never crowding, never talking, and he went home at dark. And between the 2 of them all season there passed maybe a dozen words, and about half of those were the word rain. I'll tell you now so you're not waiting on it. He never once asked her for a thing. Some help is loud, his wasn't. The valley, meanwhile, watched. Of course the valley watched. You can't hide a third of a farm planted in nursery blocks from men who drive that road twice a day. And what they saw, come July, was rows of deliberately ruined corn. Because that's what an inbred line looks like when it's coming down toward pure. Runty, thin, gap-toothed little ears on short stalks, blocks of them. Right there on Silas Fenn's good bottomland where he ought to have been growing a cash crop like a sensible man. And the valley looked at that, and the valley nodded to itself. And the valley said the thing it had been waiting to say since the day she loaded those sacks alone. The girl's gone the same way as the father. Tinkering, ruining good ground, boiling her seed corn, near enough. Amos Kettleman told it at the feed store as a sorrowful thing. Del Pruitt told it as a joke, and told it loud, and it traveled well because a joke about a fool always travels well. And here is the part I love. The part that's yours, and mine, and nobody else's in that whole valley. You know what they didn't. You've been in the rented room. You've read the notebooks over the old man's shoulder. You know those runty little ears aren't failure, they're the ugly, patient, deliberate middle of the best corn the Dawson Valley will ever grow. The valley's laughing at a fool. And they're the fools. Every one of them, and they don't know it yet, and Cora Fenn walks her rows in the July heat with her arms cut to ribbons and lets them laugh. Because she cannot afford to explain, and would not if she could. That's a hard kind of strength. The kind that lets them be wrong about you because setting them straight costs more than you've got. She might have made it clean through that first season on patience and Harlan's silent hands. But farming doesn't let you off that easy, and neither does a story worth your time. It came in July. A green afternoon that went yellow, and then that low bruised color that any farm child learns to fear before they learn to read. The air went still and heavy, and the birds quit, and Belle and Major started fretting in the pasture. And Cora came out onto the porch and looked at the west sky and knew. Hail! She stood on her own porch and watched it come across the valley. A gray wall dragging under the cloud, and there was not one single thing on God's earth she could do about it. You can't cover a field. You can only stand and watch it happen to you. And it came over her farm and it laid into the corn for 11 minutes, ice out of a summer sky, stones of it bouncing in the yard, hammering the roof. And she stood under the porch eave with Rook pressed shaking against her leg, and Harlan's dim shape doing the same thing on his own porch a quarter-mile east, both of them just watching. And when it passed, and the sun came back out cruel and bright like nothing had happened, she walked out into the wet and the cold smell to see what was left. One nursery block was gone. Flat. The hail had cut a path the way hail does, sparing this and taking that with no reason a person could find, and the path it took ran straight through one of her 2 breeding lines. The line was young, not far down the road to Pure. But it was a line. It was 2 years of somebody's work between her father and her. And it lay in the mud shredded to green rags. Gone, she stood in the ruin of it in the steaming afternoon, and she did not cry there either. Though I think it would have been all right if she had. There was no one to see, but Harlan, and Harlan would never have told. And that same week, as if the world wanted to make its meaning plain, Emil Bergstrom took sick. His heart, the doctor said. Rest, the doctor said, as though rest was a thing an old man in a rented room could buy. He couldn't come to the Rose anymore. He could sit up some days and read the books and tell her what to do, and some days he couldn't sit up at all. So there it was, laid out the exact shape of her father's whole life. A ruined block of corn, a failing old man, a laughing valley, a note coming due. Cora Fenn stood at the bottom of that July with every single thing pointing the same direction, toward the thing everyone already believed, that a Fenn tinkers and a Fenn ruins good ground and a Fenn ends broke. And the smart money, the Vernon Thorne money, had it right all along. That's the moment they came for the seed. Del Pruitt drove out the lane on a Saturday in his good car, sent, and everyone including Cora knew who sent him. He didn't get out at first. He sat in the car with the window down and looked at her ruined block and her runty Rose, and he smiled that smile, and then he made her the offer he'd been sent to make. Mr. Thorne, he said, was feeling generous. Mr. Thorne understood a girl could get in over her head, no shame in it, happened to grown men every day this year. And Mr. Thorne was willing to take the seed corn off her hands. The whole Bergstrom lot, back at a fair price, cash money, right now, today, before the note came due. Enough to get her through the winter. All she had to do was hand back the sacks and the trouble both. And I want you to see what that offer really was, because Pruitt was too dull to hide it, and Cora was too sharp to miss it. It wasn't mercy. It was the guillotine, dressed for church. Thorne wanted the last living seed of a rival strain out of his valley for good, dead in his crib or ground to feed, and he was willing to pay a girl a winter's cash to hand him the one thing that could ever undo him. Take the money. It was the sensible thing. It was the only sensible thing. Sell the corn back, clear the winter, maybe scrape the note. Live to farm plain and quiet like the valley wanted, and let her father's 9 years and Emil's 40 die in a grinder and be forgotten. Every reasonable voice in her head said take it. Cora stood in her father's coat in her own lane, and she looked at Del Pruitt in his good car, and she thought about an ear of corn rolling off a table to her boot. And she thought about an old man's face changing in a rented room, and she thought about the 3 seasons her father had been from finishing, that were now 2 seasons, that were now, if she held, just 1. No, she said. Pruitt's smile didn't understand it at first. He asked her did she hear the number. She said she heard it fine. He told her, not smiling now, that she'd be off this land by October, that the note would eat her, that Thorne would end up with the ground and the seed both, and she'd have gotten nothing for it when she could have had a winter's cash in her hand today. He told her she was being a fool, exactly like her father, and this time he didn't dress it up. And Cora Fenn stood there and took it, and when he was done she said the thing that turned the whole story, the thing that cost her more than the $86, more than the third of her ground, more than her cut-up arms. "Tell Mr. Thorne I thank him for the offer," she said. "And tell him I'm keeping the corn." She did not sell the seed. Instead, That week, she drove into town and she sold the two things she had left in the world that were worth anything. Her father's watch, gold. The one thing of his the fever hadn't been able to take, that she'd meant to keep till she died. And Bell and Major, the team, sold to a farmer 2 townships over who'd treat them decent. Which meant she'd break the next season's ground herself somehow, or on borrowed horses, or on her own 2 hands. She took what those 2 things brought, and it was not much. It was a hard, cruel not much, and she put it against the winter, and against the note, and against the cost of finishing, and she bet every dime of it and every hour she had left on one thing. One season. The finish. The double cross her father had been 3 seasons from, and was now, if the last line held, just 1. She rebuilt the ruined block from saved reserve ears, the way Emil told her from his sickbed, kernel by kernel, on her knees in the replanted mud. And she told the valley nothing. She went to town in her one dress, and she was polite at the feed store, and she let Pruitt's joke keep traveling, and she said not one word about what was standing green in secret in her nursery blocks. Let them think she'd sold the watch to eat. Let them think whatever kept them from looking too close. And up the road, in a house with the biggest windows in the valley, Vernon Thorne heard from Pruitt that the girl had said no, and Vernon Thorne did a thing then that Cora didn't know about yet. A quiet thing. A paper thing. The kind of thing men like him do in offices while girls like her are on their knees in the mud. He went to the Cedar Valley Farmers Bank. And he bought her note, $640 of Fenn debt, bought off the bank cheap, because the bank was glad to be shut of a loan it figured was going to default anyway. So that now the paper that could take her farm was not held by some faceless bank in town. It was held by the man who'd told a barn full of laughing men that she'd boil it by August. He held her whole life in a drawer now, and he settled back to wait for October, certain, patient, already spending the 80 acres in his mind. She didn't know it yet. She was out in the rows in the last long light of that summer, bagging the final ears of the finished cross with her cut hands, writing the last numbers in her father's book by the failing sun. The corn was coming. She could feel it in her palms before she could prove it, the way you know weather. Something was standing up in those blocks that had never stood in this valley before. She didn't know Thorne held the note. She didn't know a county man had already walked her fence line and seen what stood there and gotten an idea of his own. She only knew she'd said no, and sold the watch and bet it all, and that in 3 weeks or 4 the ears would tell her whether her father had been a genius or a fool, and whether she'd just thrown the last of everything after him into the ground. And on the far side of the valley, folded in a bank drawer with Vernon Thorne's name on it, the clock on $640 had already started to run. The ears came in on a Tuesday. She'd waited 9 days past when Emil said to wait, because she couldn't make herself do it sooner. The husks had gone dry and papery on the double cross block, the tassels brown, the whole field standing quiet in the low September sun. She walked the rows once at dawn with Rook at her heel and didn't touch a thing. She just looked. The corn stood taller than she was, taller than her father had ever gotten anything to stand, and it stood the same. That was the thing that stopped her breath. Row on row, plant on plant, every stalk at the same height, every ear set at the same place on the stalk. Like something machined instead of grown. She reached up and pulled the first ear. She stood there and peeled the husk back with her thumbnail, slow, the way you open a letter you're afraid of. And there it was, deep gold kernels, packed tight, no gaps, no chaff, filled clean to the tip. She turned it in her hand. She'd seen good corn before. She'd never seen this. This was her father's 9 years lying in her palm, finished, standing up out of the ground where the whole valley swore nothing but weeds and foolishness would ever grow. She sat down right there in the dirt between the rows and cried. Not the soft kind. The kind that shakes you. Rook came and pushed his head under her arm, and she held onto the dog and the ear both, and let it come. Silas Fenn had died halfway. She'd carried the other half across the finish line with her own 2 hands. and he wasn't here to see it, and that was the whole of the grief and the whole of the joy sitting in her chest at once. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and got up and went to work. She bagged the best ears first, the way Emil taught her, the 10 cleanest for seed. She marked them in her father's book with the last of his pencil. And when she carried the first basket out of that field, she carried it like it weighed nothing, though her arms shook, because the note was still in Thorne's drawer, and the corn was only corn until somebody with authority said otherwise. Pruitt came the same week. She should have known he would. He drove up the lane in the co-op truck and got out slow, hat back on his head, looking at her stunted nursery blocks along the road with a little smile. Because from the road that was all a passing man could see, the runty inbred rose. The deliberate ones, the ones the whole valley took for ruin. He couldn't see the double-cross field. It was behind the barn. "Miss Fenn," he said, "come to do you a kindness." She stood on the porch step and didn't come down. "Winter's long," Pruitt said. "That note of yours falls due. Mr. Thorne's a practical man. He's willing to take the seed lot off your hands. What you paid for it, near enough. $80. Cash money, today, and you don't go into the cold with nothing. $80. 6 less than she'd paid." He said it like mercy. "He wants the seed," she said. "He wants you looked after. He wants the seed dead," she said. "And he's willing to pay $80 to make sure nothing of my father's outlives him in this valley." Pruitt's smile thinned. "Now that's an ungrateful way to talk." "You can tell Mr. Thorne no," Cora said. "Same as I told him in June. You can tell him I'll settle my own note in my own way." "With what?" Pruitt laughed, and there it was, the laugh, the barn laugh, the one that had followed her out with the sacks on her shoulder. "Girl, you sold your team. You sold your daddy's watch. The whole valley knows it. You've got a field of dwarf corn a hog wouldn't finish and a debt coming due, and you're turning down cash. That's your father in you, plain. Same fool blood." He talked big too, right up until the bank put him in the ground. She didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say to a man who thought her father's blood was an insult. She just stood there until Pruitt got tired of standing in her yard, and he climbed back in the truck and pulled away, and she watched the dust settle back down over the lane. Then she went inside and stood a long while over the notebooks, and she made herself a promise she'd already made a dozen times. She would finish it. She would not sell it back, whatever it cost. That was the point she couldn't come back from. She'd sold the watch and the team to get this far. There was nothing left to sell but the land itself and the seed, and she would not sell the seed. So she'd finish, and the corn would carry her, or nothing would. The wind came in October. It came the way the bad ones come in that country, out of the northwest with no warning past a green sky, and it laid the valley flat. Cora stood in the barn door in the dark with the whole building groaning around her and Rook pressed against her leg, and she listened to it take the county down. In the morning she walked out into a changed world. Amos Kettleman's 40 acres of corn was on the ground, stalks snapped and leaning every one the same direction like a crowd knocked down. Same across the road. Same as far as she could see. Every field in the valley lodged flat. A whole year of somebody's work laid over in the mud where the picker couldn't reach half of it. Every field but hers. She came around the barn and stopped. The double cross stood. 10,000 plants, and they stood. Straight up, ranked, not a stalk of them down. The wind that flattened 40 years of the valley's seed had gone through her father's cross like it wasn't there. She walked the rows with her heart going hard, and she couldn't find more than a dozen plants leaning in the whole block. Silas had bred for it. It was in his notebooks, in his crabbed hand, strong stalk, strong root, standing power. One of the traits he'd chased for 9 years, and here it was, proved in one night by the same storm that ruined every man who'd laughed at him. Harlan Voss saw it first, over the fence. He'd been out looking at his own father's flattened corn, and he came along the line fence and stood there a long time, just looking at the Fenn field standing green and straight in the middle of the ruin. He didn't say much. He never did. All summer he'd worked her rows at dawn without a dozen words, detasseling beside her, bagging ears, then going home. But he stood at that fence, and he looked, and then he looked at her, and he said, "It stood." "It stood," she said. "Whole valleys down," Harlan said. "And it stood." He shook his head slow, like a man seeing something he'd have to think about a while. Then he went home. But word travels in a flat country. By the end of the week, every man who came to look at his own rick had heard it. The Fenn girls' corn stood. They said it two ways. Some said it like a wonder. Some said it like a trick. But they said it. And one of the men who heard it was the county extension agent, the young one out of the college at Ames, who drove the gravel roads all season measuring other men's failures. He came down her lane in his state car and asked to walk the field, and she let him, because she didn't yet know what he had in mind. He walked the rows with a little book. He measured the height. He pulled an ear here and there and thumbed the kernels, and his eyebrows kept climbing. He asked her what the cross was, and she told him some of it, not all. He asked who bred it, and she said her father, and finished it, and didn't say her own name loud. He left without saying what he was going to do, and what he did, without asking her, was take a 10-ear sample of her hybrid, entered under the name he wrote in his little book, and send it to the Iowa State Fair, to the seed corn class, where the whole state's best corn men showed their finest against each other under the high windows of the grain hall. She found out 3 weeks later, when the premium book came in the mail. But before that came Thorne. He came himself, which he never did. He drove down her lane in the good car with Pruitt beside him, and he got out, and he didn't take his hat off. He stood in her yard, 56 years old, heavy and certain, and he looked at her standing field behind the barn with a face like a man reading a number he didn't like. "You've done a thing here," Thorne said. "I'll grant it. Corn that stands. There's men would pay for that." "There are," Cora said. "I'm one of them." He turned to her. "But I want you to understand your position, Miss Fenn, before you get ideas out of one lucky storm. That note on this place. $640, due at harvest. You know who holds it now?" She didn't. She saw it land on his face that she didn't, and she saw him enjoy it. "I do," Thorne said. "Bought it off the bank in June, the day you told Pruitt no. So let's be plain with each other, the way grown people are. Come October, you don't put $640 cash in my hand, and this farm is mine. The barn, the land, the field, all of it. And I'll have that corn of yours anyway, for the price of a piece of paper, and you'll be off this place by the frost." He let that sit. "I came down to tell you myself. So you'd have the winter to make peace with it, and not tell yourself some story where it comes out different." Cora stood very still. The clock she hadn't known about had been running since June, and now she knew, and it had 3 weeks left on it. "Get off my land, Mr. Thorne," she said. "While it's still my land." He almost smiled. He put a hand to his hat brim, not lifting it, just touching it, the way you tip your hat at something already dead. Then he and Pruitt got back in the car and drove away, and she stood in the yard until the dust was gone, and then her knees wanted to go and she made them hold. $640. 3 weeks. And a field of the best corn in the valley that wasn't worth $1 until somebody would buy it, and the man who held her note had just made sure no house in 3 counties would, because they all did business with Thorne. The premium book came 4 days after that. She almost didn't open it. It was state paper, official, and she thought it was something to do with the note. But she opened it, and she read her way down the seed corn class entries, and there, low on the page, she found it. An entry number. A 10-ear plot. And the county agent's hand had written beside it the words she'd never in her life said out loud about her own corn. Fenn hybrid, Dawson Valley. He'd entered it. Without asking. Her father's cross was going to the Iowa State Fair, and the judging fell the same week as the note came due. She sat at the kitchen table half the night over that. The fair was 2 days' travel and back. There was an entry fee she hadn't paid, and a train she couldn't buy a seat on, because she had $87 to her name and a $640 note, and every cent had to go at Thorne or the farm was gone. She couldn't spend it going to a fair to win a ribbon. A ribbon didn't pay a note. A ribbon was just cloth. She'd stay home and pick her corn and try somehow to turn it to cash before October, and the fair could go on without her, and the county man could keep his idea to himself. She'd about decided it when Emil sent for her. Emil Bergstrom was 71 years old and dying by inches in that rented room over the feed store, the room where he'd shown her the notebooks a year and a lifetime ago. He was thinner now, his hands shook. But his eyes were clear when she came in, and he'd had one of the feed store boys write out for him what the fair judging was, and when it fell, and he knew. "You're not going," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew her. "I can't, Emil, the note. I can't spend the fair." "No," Emil said. "You can't." And then the old man reached under his blanket, and his shaking hand came out with a fold of money, soft old bills, and he held it out to her. $12, he said. "It's what I've got. It's all of it. You take it." "Emil, no. That's your." "Cora," he said her name like a man laying down a card he'd been holding his whole life. "I gave up. You understand me? I had 40 years of that corn in my head, and I let the bank take it, and I sat down in a rented room to die. Because I was ashamed. And I told myself it was finished. Your father didn't give up. He worked it till the fever took him, and he was right, and I was the coward, not him. Now here's you. 20 years old. And you did the thing I quit, and he died halfway too." His hand shook harder. "You take my $12 and you get on that train and you go stand in that hall and you let them read your father's name off a champion ribbon in front of the whole state of Iowa. Let an old man see one honest breeder outlast him before I go. That's worth $12. That's worth more than I ever had." She took the money. She couldn't not. And she bent down and kissed the old man's forehead, and he patted her hand, and she went to catch the train. The seed corn hall at the Iowa State Fair was a long, high room full of Iowa's finest corn under tall, dusty windows. Table after table of 10 earplots, each man's best, laid out on white cards. The smell of dry corn and sawdust and coffee. Farmers in their town suits standing at the rail 3 deep. Because in that country in that year, seed corn was a serious business, and the champion of that hall was a made man. Cora stood at the rail in her one-town dress, the good dress kept for church and burying. And she felt every inch the girl in the borrowed clothes. She'd set her 10 ears out that morning with hands that wouldn't quite hold steady. "Fenn Hybrid, Dawson Valley," the card said. She stood back and watched the men walk the tables and not stop at hers. Because nobody knew the name, and a name nobody knew wasn't worth stopping for. And down the hall, at the long table under the middle window, exhibiting a 10-ear plot of Bergstrom gold under his own name, stood Vernon Thorne, with Pruitt beside him. They'd come to win. Thorne had bought Emil's whole operation at the foreclosure, the gold and the name both, and he'd come to the fair to be crowned the seedsman of the valley he was buying up. To put his purple ribbon on the wall and make the gold his, and be done with the whole business of the Fenns and the Bergstroms forever. Thorne saw her at the rail. She watched him see her. She watched him place her, the girl in the church dress, and half smile, and lean and say something to Pruitt, and Pruitt look down the hall at her and laugh. The barn laugh. Even here. Even now. She held the rail and let it go through her. The judge came at 11. He was an old college man from Ames, white-haired, slow, with spectacles down his nose and a way of picking up an ear and turning it that said he'd turned 100,000 of them. He worked the tables one at a time. He spent his time. He came to Thorne's Bergstrom gold, and he picked up an ear and turned it and set it down and made a note, and Thorne stood a little taller. The gold was famous corn. Everybody knew it. Then the judge came down the row to the low end where the unknown names were, and he came to 10 ears of gold on a card that said Fenn. He picked up an ear. He turned it in the window light. He didn't set it down. He picked up a second ear and held them side by side. He thumbed the kernels. He turned them tip to butt. And then the old man did a thing that made the whole rail go quiet, because the men who knew fairs knew what it meant. He turned around and he called 2 other men over, 2 colleagues, cornmen, judges, and the 3 of them stood over her 10 ears with their heads down. And they didn't say anything a body at the rail could hear, but their hands moved over the corn slow and careful, the way men handle a thing they didn't expect to find. Cora's heart was going so hard she thought the rail would feel it. The steward came with the ribbons, and the head judge took the purple one, the champion, the sweepstakes of the whole seed corn class, and he carried it down the table past the Bergstrom gold, past all the famous names, to the low end. And he hung the champion ribbon on the card that said Fenn Hybrid, Dawson Valley. And the steward read the card out loud, the way they did, so the whole hall could hear who'd won. Champion seed corn, the steward called. Fenn Hybrid. Dawson Valley. The hall turned. That was the thing she'd remember all her life, the way the faces turned, one after another, down the long room toward the girl in the church dress at the rail. And she watched 2 faces in particular. She watched Pruitt's smile fall off first, all at once, the way a thing falls when the nail lets go. And she watched Thorne, slower, his jaw setting hard and harder, a man doing arithmetic that wouldn't come out. A man who measured the whole world in acres and dollars standing in front of a purple ribbon that said knowledge was a deed after all, and he didn't hold the title to it. The old judge came to her at the rail. He looked at her over his spectacles, kind and curious. "Young woman," he said, "that's the finest 10 ears of seed corn in this hall, and I've judged this hall 20 years. Uniform, standing type, deep kernel. That's a finished hybrid, and a good one. Who bred it?" And there was the whole of it in one question, and she could have taken it all for herself, standing there, and no one would have known. "It was my father's cross," Cora said, quiet, so only he leaned to hear it. "Silas Fenn. He worked it 9 years. I just finished it." The judge nodded slow, like that was the right answer, the only one worth giving. "Then your father was a breeder," he said. "You tell him." "I would," she said. "He's passed." The old man took his hat off to her then, right there in the hall. And she stood at the rail with her father's ribbon hanging 10 feet away and Vernon Thorne's arithmetic still not coming out down the table. And for the first time since the winter fever she felt her father standing beside her, finished, proved, crowned. The seedmen came to Dawson Valley the week after. They came the way news like that brings them. 3 separate company men in town suits, from 3 different houses, standing at the Fenn gate in the same week with contracts in leather cases. A champion hybrid that stood through the storm that lodged a whole valley, bred and owned by one girl free and clear, that was worth more than corn to a seed house. That was worth a strain they could sell for 20 years. They stood at her gate, hats in hand, and asked to come up. And behind them, 4 days later, came the growers' co-op manager. The same co-op where Del Pruitt had told her seed selling was for houses, not housegirls, with Amos Kettleman standing right there looking away. The manager came up her lane with his hat literally in his 2 hands, turning it. And he stood on her porch step where Pruitt had stood and offered her $80, and he asked, humble, if the co-op might have the honor of handling the Fenn hybrid seed for the valley. She read every contract at the kitchen table, over her father's open notebooks, taking her time, the way the old judge had taken his. She'd learned enough from Emil to read them right. Two of the houses wanted to buy the strain outright, the whole thing, breeding rights and all, one flat sum, and never her name on it again. Good money. More money than she'd ever seen. She set those two aside. The third kept the breeding rights in her name, paid her a seed advance now and a share on every bag sold, and left the Fenn hybrid, hers to keep working. Hers to keep finishing the way her father would have. She signed that one. The advance and the fair premium together came to more than $640. She took it to town in cash. She walked into the Cedar Valley Farmers Bank in her work clothes, not the church dress, and she said she'd come to settle the Fenn note. And they told her, uncomfortable, that the bank didn't hold it anymore. That it had been sold. That the note was Vernon Thorne's. Then I'll settle it with Mr. Thorne, she said. In town. Where people can see it done. And she did. She sent word, and Thorne had to come. Because a paid note is a paid note and the law doesn't care how a man feels about it. He came to the bank lobby with Pruitt, and she counted $640 in cash into the teller's hands across the counter. In front of the loan officer and two clerks and half a dozen men who'd come in on business and stayed to watch. Because word had gone around that the Fenn girl was paying off Vernon Thorne to his face. She counted it slow. She got the note back. The paper with her father's name on it. The paper that could have taken the farm. And she folded it once and put it in her coat pocket, the deep pocket. The same pocket her father's coat had held the ear of seed corn a year before. That's the note, Mr. Thorne, she said. Paid in full. The farm's mine. Free. Thorne looked at the money on the counter and at the girl in the work coat, and he didn't have a barn full of men to laugh for him this time. He had two clerks and a teller and a lobby of neighbors watching. And the arithmetic still wouldn't come out. He'd bought a note to take a farm, and the farm had grown the one thing his money couldn't buy, and now the note was cloth in her pocket, and the 80 acres were hers. You've had a run of luck, Thorne said. Low. No, sir, Cora said. I had my father's 9 years and a year of my own. There's no luck in it. You just couldn't see it, because it doesn't come in acres. And she walked out. It came apart for them fast after that, the way it does when the one thing holding it up is gone. Del Pruitt lost his post before the snow. The houses didn't want Thorne's tired Bergstrom gold anymore, not with a champion hybrid in the same valley to be had, and a buyer whose whole value was the corn he could move, found he couldn't move the corn. Thorne had no use for a seed man who couldn't sell seed. Pruitt, who'd laughed loudest and read least, who'd mistaken the volume of his own voice for knowing something, took his leather case and his opinions to look for work in another county. And the last Cora heard he was clerking somewhere for wages. And the co-op counter where he'd turned her away had another man behind it, and Vernon Thorne. Thorne had been buying the whole Dawson Valley cheap, farm by foreclosed farm, on the certainty that the valley had nothing and would keep having nothing and would sell to him for pennies and be glad. But a valley with a champion seed strain in it, a strain grown right there. That its own farmers could raise under contract and sell at a premium, that was a valley with a reason to stay. Men who'd been ready to sell to Thorne and go west planted the Fenn hybrid under the co-op contract instead and stood their corn through the next storm and made their notes. The bottom Thorne had counted on fell out. The land he thought he'd have for pennies wasn't for sale anymore. He'd spread himself thin buying paper, and the paper he'd counted on hardest, the Fenn note, the sure thing, had been counted out on a bank counter in cash in front of the whole town. His leverage was gone. The valley he was going to own quietly went on being its own. He came to her porch one more time. In the autumn, a year almost to the day from the barn, she saw the car come down the lane and she knew it, and she didn't go inside. She waited on the porch. Thorne got out alone this time, no Pruitt. And he came up the lane, and at the bottom of her porch steps, Vernon Thorne took his hat off. First time. He held it in his hands like the co-op man had. Miss Fenn, he said, I'll come to it plain. I want to buy your seed rights. The Fenn hybrid. All of it. I'll pay you a figure. And he named it. And it was a real figure, a large one. More money than the 80 acres and the barn and everything on them was worth twice over. A figure meant to end the whole matter and put her father's 9 years under his name at last. Cora looked at him a while. Then she went inside and came back with 2 cups and the coffee pot, and she poured him one and set it on the porch rail and poured her own, and she didn't say anything about the money. She let it sit there in the yard, unanswered, until it got small. "You told the barn I'd boil it by August, Mr. Thorne," she said. "Even. No heat in it. I kept it for seed instead." That was all. She didn't name the 80 acres he'd wanted, or the note he'd bought, or the laugh Pruitt gave in the fair hall. She didn't tell him what he was. She just said the one thing, and let it be the whole answer, and drank her coffee. Thorne stood there with his hat in his hands and his coffee cooling on the rail, and his figure hanging in the air with nobody to catch it. And after a while he understood there wasn't going to be more. He put his hat back on. He left the coffee. He walked back down to the car and got in and drove down the lane, and she watched the dust rise and settle. The way she'd watched it settle the day he threatened her, and the day Pruitt offered her $80, and this time it was the last of him. He never came up the lane again. A year on, there was a June morning worth telling. Silas Fenn's notebooks weren't loose in a feed store room or stacked on a kitchen table anymore. They were bound, properly, in cloth covers, and shelved in a little farm office Cora had made of the front room, where the seed contracts lived and the breeding records grew year on year in her own hand now, picking up where his left off. The Fenn hybrid had a second cross behind it already, better than the first, because she hadn't stopped where she won. She'd kept finishing. She walked a field that morning with Emil Bergstrom. He'd got better, some. Better enough to leave the rented room. Better enough to come live in the back bedroom of the Fenn place and be useful, which was the medicine he'd needed all along. He leaned on a cane and went slow, but his eye was still the best in the valley, and he walked her rows and named what he saw, and it was tall, and it was uniform, and it stood. 10,000 plants of it, green in the June sun. Off at the far end of the field, Harlan Voss worked the rows. He still didn't say much. But he stayed now. And he'd built her a proper seed house that winter without being asked, the way he did things, and there was a thermos they shared at the turn of the rows, and a look that passed between them, unhurried, that didn't need to be a motor to be real. It could wait. They both knew how to wait. They'd proved that. She stopped at the end of the row where the old man could rest on his cane, and the two of them looked back over the standing corn. They laughed at her, once, a barn full of them. They laughed because they measured her the only way they knew how, in acres and dollars and the width of a girl's shoulders, and by that measure she was nothing, a 20-year-old orphan with $86 and a dead fool's notebooks. What they couldn't see, what Thorne with all his money never once saw, was that she'd been standing on something the whole time that they had no way to price. 9 years of a quiet man's work. A method only she and one old seedsman held. A thing that wasn't land and wasn't cash and couldn't be bought at a bank or bid away in a barn, and that turned out, in the end, to be worth more than all the acres Vernon Thorne ever tried to swallow. Inside the barn, pinned to the door where the seed sacks used to hang the year she carried them out alone through the laughing, was the purple champion ribbon. Fenn hybrid, Dawson Valley. She'd hung it there on purpose, where the sacks had hung, so she'd see it every morning and remember both things at once. What it cost. And what it was worth. She finished her coffee and gave Emil his arm, and they walked back up toward the house in the good light, slow, in no hurry at all, because for the first time in her life there was nowhere she had to be but exactly here. Tell me in the comments, who ever underestimated you?